Very few companies control entire markets. That's because of Ronald Reagan, and the growing wealth gap, he had a hand in that too. At the start of his presidency in the early 1980s, companies outside the US were growing stronger and more efficient, which cost Americans jobs. So Reagan responded by changing the laws that kept monopolies in check, deregulating corporations, and lowering taxes for the private sector so the US could keep up.
Lower our tax rates, deregulation, stimulate new opportunities to make America great again.
While these changes did lead to a surge in economic growth, who did they benefit most? Not workers or consumers. Let's take a look at some of what the GOP's most revered president did in office. During his first year, he instituted across-the-board tax cuts that mostly benefited corporations and wealthy Americans.
Our purpose was to provide incentive for the individual, incentives for business to encourage production and hiring of the unemployed, and to free up money for investment.
This became known as trickle-down economics. It's the idea that fewer taxes and regulations for corporations and the wealthy allow them to hire more employees and raise wages, stimulating the economy and growing everyone's wealth. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. That same year in 1981, Reagan altered antitrust laws, almost completely eliminating Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which makes it against the law to monopolize or attempt to monopolize any part of trade or commerce. People who liked the idea argue that the change combined with tax cuts would help businesses rise up to a global scale through things like mergers and acquisitions, and that it would allow them to hire more workers and combat growing unemployment rates. Though Clinton and Obama may have later tried to reverse lax antitrust enforcement, Reagan-era antitrust policy prevailed. Author David Dang claimed the antitrust theory that began with Reagan has brought us to a period of market concentration unrivaled since the Gilded Age. On top of rolling back antitrust laws, in 1982, the Reagan-appointed head of the SEC made it legal for companies to repurchase their shares. So most of the money public corporations made wasn't invested back into its people like Reagan claimed it would be. Instead, it was put back into its own stocks to return profits to its investors. Before the change, this was against the law, and that law has never been put back into place. While moves to deregulate corporations may have helped the US compete in the global market more effectively, they came at the cost of the poor middle class, despite claims that suggest otherwise, like this one.
Yes, it created opportunity for those who had before been economically disenfranchised, the poor and the minorities.
This couldn't be further from the truth. Since the start of Reagan's presidency, the wealth gap between the rich and poor began to widen exponentially, and it has hit racial minorities the hardest. From 1978 to 2021, CEO pay rose by nearly 1,500%, while employee pay rose just 18%. From 1980 to 2016, overall income inequality in the U.S. increased by roughly 20%, leaving the U.S. with the highest wealth gap of any country. The wealth of black households and white households also began to diverge in the early 80s. That gap has never closed. Ultimately, the idea that money from corporations and wealthy people would make it to the hands of lower income individuals through tax cuts and market deregulation was proven false, but people on the right still push those ideas.
Under my plan, no American company will pay more than 15% of their business income in taxes.
If we get back to booming economic growth, the kind that always follows when we put in place tax reform and regulatory reform, the kind of growth we saw in the 80s under Reagan.
Leading a revolution like Reagan did in 1980, that's what I'm aiming to lead in 2024.